Hey, welcome to Shop Talk with Brandi and James.
We talk about all things related to mental health and cross-cultural workers.
Thanks for joining us, and welcome to Season 3.
Here we go.
Hey, welcome to Shop Talk. Thanks for joining us today. Today, we are going to talk to Stephen Jones, actually sitting in his podcast studio, which is so fun and professional, and I love it.
Nice.
But Stephen has his own podcast. We're going to talk to him maybe some about that, but definitely about some of the work he's done. So let me introduce Stephen Jones. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. So Stephen W. Jones lives and works with his family here in Berlin, Germany. He has taught, trained, written, and studied at the intersection of intercultural relations, cross-cultural ministry, and political science. He earned his Ph.D. in international development at the University of Southern Mississippi and his M.A. in Intercultural Relations from the University of the Pacific, in conjunction with the Intercultural Communication Institute. He was formerly Assistant Professor of International Studies at Crown College and Assistant Professor of Intercultural Studies at Grace University. Stephen works to see transformation in the lives of individuals, communities, and the world. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us again. And would you please, in your own words and ability, tell us where you work here in Berlin?
Sure, I work with Envision Berlin. I'm the Fotomitarbeiter für internationale Kulturfragen und Verständigung. That's a really fun place to be.
Love that. Stephen's written a really great book called Transitions Across Cultures, a guide to culture shock for travelers and those who love them.
Nice.
I really wanted Stephen to say where he works. I could say it, but it would be painful for me to say and for everyone to hear.
How long have you been in Berlin?
About 20 months.
Okay.
Well, tell us a little bit about your book and just why you decided to write this, what kind of got you into the process of thinking about writing it.
So when I wrote it, I had been working with students who were studying abroad for 6 months at a time and had also been learning about cultural transition. Also, I was seeing how disruptive cultural transitions were for my students, and then also beginning to reflect on my own experiences as a kid, things that I hadn't been aware of and hadn't processed. And I was just like, I just feel like this needs to all be in one place. So the ideas in the book are not original to me. It's just trying to put them, make them accessible to people. And that's really where it came from, was just kind of feeling like there was this gap that I didn't understand why that gap existed.
What was the age of the students you were working with?
So they were all college students. They were often going in their sophomore year.
Gotcha.
We were doing some de-romanticizing of their ideas of what cross-cultural life and work would be. And so it was it was a painful program, and they were studying in a place that was really challenging physically often. Just daily life was really challenging. But team life was very challenging. It was also, in this team context. And that's where, sometimes you can kind of, pretend to yourself like you're not experiencing the difficulties of a cultural transition. But when you're experiencing that with teammates, it's really hard to hide some of the pain and some of the discomfort. And even if you don't know what's going on, other people are affected by it. And so, I think they often came back a lot more reflective about themselves and about what it was that they thought they might be led to do in the world. And hopefully the goal was definitely not to say don't do this, but also to, be really honest about what you're getting into.
Right. And on that, you talk in your book about understanding what you bring of yourself and your culture onto the field. So with that in mind, like what would you say culture is, and just how would you define it?
Yeah, I think the simple definition that a friend of mine used that I kind of grabbed onto is it's just how people do their stuff together, which actually captures a few different elements of culture. There's another definition that I really like from Milton Bennett, and I'll paraphrase it, but basically it's the learned and shared values, beliefs, and behaviors of a group of interacting people. Yeah, and I mean, culture is a really tricky subject. It's defined so many different ways, and so it's always worth stopping to say, okay, what do you mean by it? It's kind of a frustrating subject in that it's kind of amorphous, and it's always, like, I don't know. One author that I've referred to before talks about it as squishy, which I think is a good word for it.
It is.
Great word.
Right.
And so each person has all these different elements of that they're bringing, whether that's, things with your gender, so you're experiencing the world one way because of that, or because of where you grew up, or what vocation you're in. And there's just all of these different layers. Super interesting.
I found that when we lived in Central Asia, learning about, okay, well, is this thinking about like working with the locals there, and my perception of locals and my perception of what I thought was right, is this just my culture, or is this really like some morally right thing? whether it's like men and women sitting in church together, sitting on opposite sides of the
Mhm.
church, or like, I mean, is there anything morally right or wrong about that? Or,
And some of those questions go really deep, right? It's like, and that can be super unsettling. Yeah.
seems like there's also a rush to understand culture, think that we've understood. Well, we've got it. Oh, yeah, we understand this now.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that's really difficult with culture shock in particular is that often people don't realize that they're experiencing it because, especially when you have some of those kind of early wins of figuring out how things work. And then somebody teaches you, okay, well, here's how we do things. And you don't realize that actually you're being constantly unsettled by not knowing how things work. And yeah, I think one of the things that's fascinating to me is I don't know what a percentage would be, but I would say most people that I've interacted with that are going through culture shock do not recognize it, even if they're aware of the idea of culture shock.
I think I definitely knew. When the honeymoon was over, I knew.
How did you know, James?
I think stress, expectations, I think, are a huge part of cultural adaptation. And that's why so many people find working with their expat colleagues sometimes even more stressful than whatever culture they're shifting in, because they had so many expectations of, well, that will be the easiest because they're from my home country or they're from a Western context. And so I think expectations are a huge part of it. When you first land, you kind of, there's hopefully some expectations that are a little deeper of, oh, this is going to be different. And just because it's different doesn't mean it's right or wrong. I think for me, there reached a point where some of those differences were really starting to stress me out. I remember one time I lived in Kenya for 5 years before moving to North Africa, before moving to Spain, where I live now, where there was a lot of security coming in and out of things. And I was going to play a sport one evening and driving in at the front gate, there was a guy that, was doing the extra level of security. And I was just getting pretty annoyed. And then I had to stop. And of course, my car was 100 years old and broken. And he wanted to look under the hood. And I get out and I'm like, well, what are you looking for? He goes, I am looking for a bomb. I'm like, do you know what a bomb even looks like? He said, don't worry, I know. Anyway, that was an indicator to me that I was experiencing cultural stress.
For mine would be fighting, not even arguing, fighting with the traffic police in Central Asia. So if you spend 5 minutes with my kids, they'll throw me under the bus and tell you stories about me fighting with the traffic police. Yeah. How about you, Stephen?
I think we knew that we would be experiencing culture shock. And actually one of the things that was interesting is we were doing a podcast with a colleague where he was walking through my book with my wife and I as we were moving here, kind of paying attention to this as it was unfolding. But yeah, just the level of being kind of on edge, right? Like there's just like where little things just throw you so much. Yeah, the disproportionate response to the situation, I think, is one of the things for me that, which can go in a number of different directions, right? Sometimes it's like laughing way too much for something that's just not that funny, and then sometimes it's like you just have this anger response to something that's like, yeah, that shouldn't have made me angry, like, or not that much anyway, just things like that, off balance, I think.
I appreciate in your book when you talk about culture shock is a process and it's not just a one-off thing that happens, but it's sort of, I want to say cumulative.
Yeah, cumulative disorientation. Yeah. I think that's, I mean, it's interesting because we have a lot of these terms that get used a lot. And so people, I a lot of times will hear people saying, oh, I had a culture shock when this event happened. And I understand what's meant there. And then I just try to, give different words for that so that we can use the words a little bit more precisely to accomplish something, specific with them. But yeah, I think that idea that it is this buildup of being disoriented over and over and over and over again, and often in very small ways. And I think that's where it can really sneak up on people. I mean, a little thing like, do you know what you're buying at the grocery store? And, when you thought you were getting something and then you end up getting home and it's something else, like that's not a big deal, right? Sometimes in the moment it's like, oh, shoot, I got to go back to the store or, whatever. But like that little moment of disorientation multiplied times 1,000, is actually really, really disruptive.
I want to take it back a few steps, talking about knowing your own self and knowing your own culture. How do you help people who are just going onto the field? And understand that, and how do you help them kind of look into themselves and their own culture to understand more of what they're bringing into the field of their own selves?
Yeah, I think it depends on kind of how much space we have to press into things. So I use the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, or the intercultural development continuum, as a way to kind of frame a lot of that. And so recognizing that depending on how somebody perceives cultural difference and similarity, they may or may not at that moment have the capacity to recognize their own culture. And so it really depends on kind of where each person is starting at. But the idea of starting to recognize things that you think are normal but are actually specific to your culture can be really important. Yeah. But also can be really challenging. When you take something that you're like, this is how the world works, and you reduce that down and say, well, no, this is how your world works, your version of the world works. That can be really unsettling to people.
It can, right. In your book, you have an example of a traffic light. I think it's really good. Breaking it down to what do you actually see here? People are saying, well, if red means stop and yellow means slow down, green means go. It's like, maybe, but what do you see here? What do you know that you see here? So,
yeah, that's one where I definitely have had people get annoyed with me, because like, especially when it's projected up on a screen or something. I'm like, okay, so what do you actually see? It's a traffic light. Well, what do you actually see? And yeah, going way down to okay, are we talking about photons, or like what's happening here?
You mentioned just trying to compile all of the transition resources that are out there. And do you have a particular model or guide or thing that you kind of settled on and found really helpful, both for the young people you are coaching through their cross-cultural experiences, or even for yourself in your own transition?
I think that William Bridges' model of transitions has been really, really transformative. And his model starts with the idea of endings. And so instead of starting with what are all the things that are new that you're experiencing, say, okay, what are all the things that have ended, what are the things that were true of you that aren't true of you anymore? What are the things that you used to be able to easily do and now you can't? And that, starting with the endings, seems to be so helpful. And people beginning to recognize, like, oh, I probably shouldn't feel okay right now. And I think that's been one of the big things, is sometimes people have been really resistant to the idea of identifying their own culture shock or their own transition stress. And I think helping people to get to the point where they say, me experiencing culture shock right now, or me experiencing transition stress right now, doesn't mean that I'm somehow weak. It just means that, like, that's what should be happening because I'm experiencing a tremendous amount of loss right now.
That's one of my favorite phrases in counseling, is just, it would be far stranger if you weren't experiencing what you're experiencing right now. That would be more concerning, not that you are, and suddenly realize you need to grieve all of these losses, or realizing that, oh wow, this is hard, or this is different. And that, of course, is what is normal. And I think normalizing is a lot of what we do in counseling for people.
I think we tend to spiritualize our process adjusting to culture and transition, and that we put these shoulds on ourselves, or shouldn'ts on ourselves. Like, I shouldn't be feeling this way right now. I shouldn't be struggling so much. And I shouldn't be experiencing these losses. It should all just be like, praise be to God. It's like,
especially if you have a strong sense of call attached to what you're doing, I think can feel like admitting that you're not doing okay with what you're doing could be questioning the sense of, well, should we have made this move at all? Or and that has sometimes really deep faith implications for people.
Yeah, it does. What do you tell people if you're talking to someone and they're in the midst of transition, like they're in the trenches in transition, so they're over the honeymoon phase, and they're kind of sinking a little bit, maybe they're really struggling against sinking and they don't really want to admit that they're there?
I think storytelling can be something that's very helpful. Talking about my own story of transition or other people's story of transition. That's part of why we recorded the other podcast with my wife and I, as we went through this, was we said, well, let's put that out there so other people can maybe see themselves in our story. Try to give a concrete example of somebody else experiencing something. And then I think for others, one of the things that we're trying to figure out in our program here with our interns is, how do we help them come into contact with some of the abstract frameworks of, okay, here's what people often are experiencing at different stages, and here's some of the stressors that people experience, but to kind of give them something that in both cases is outside of themselves, where they can maybe see something. And if then they identify with it, then it gives them a place to start exploration.
Right.
Yeah, it can be so disorienting. I think it's hard to like get out of one's own experience enough to get that perspective. So that sounds really helpful to be able to come out and identify some of the things. Oh yeah, actually that's what it is. Or I didn't have the words for it, but that's what it is. It's just I think that that middle phase can be so disorienting for people, the neutral zone.
Yeah. Yeah. I had students who, once they recognized their own transition experience, really resented the language of neutral zone because they were like, "This isn't neutral. This feels terrible."
But it's so valuable.
Yeah,
It's so valuable to not rush through it and to be kind of curious about yourself in that.
and that neutral in the sense of like you put the car in neutral, you can spend a tremendous amount of energy, and it's not going anywhere. At least not connected to the energy you're spending, right?
Mm-hmm. I remember thinking about transitions when we lived in Central Asia. We moved there straight off the plane. Everything was different. It was so obvious everything was different. It was so obvious that I was different from them too. And that in some ways made the transition more tangible because it was so obvious that there was a lot we were adjusting to. And then when we moved to Germany, I thought, what is wrong with me? This is harder than I thought it would be because that it felt more similar.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't so obvious. All the newness and differentness wasn't so obvious. It was much more under the surface, whereas where we lived before, it was in our face all the time.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. I hear that from Latinos who are living in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
It was more difficult than they thought it would be.
Mm.
We all speak Spanish. I already know the language. The culture is similar in some ways. And I think that has also been a big struggle is, oh, no, actually, it's significantly a greater gap and perhaps a wider neutral zone than people were prepared for.
That's interesting. What do you think helps people in the neutral zone to just be okay with where they are and just allow themselves to be in that process?
I think the exercise of really, and I think you mentioned this, James, but the idea of really, when you have identified those endings and those losses, taking time to mourn them can be really helpful. And then also giving people permission to find really helpful coping mechanisms that say like you're not going to be functioning 100%. And like, actually, you might never, I don't know, the number that gets thrown around here, I think is maybe you'll only ever function at 70 to 80% of your, underlying capacity when you're in a different cultural context. But I think there's the sense of like, yeah, like it's okay. And you need to take time, whether that's Sabbath time or other times to just be and to kind of detach that sense of your worth from, it depends on what underlying questions and issues you're coming into that situation with, right? But for the people that I'm working with, it's often detaching your sense of worth from what you're producing. So that I think that's a big part of it.
Helping people realize their permission to not function at 100%, which really takes so much out of you to try to do that cross-culturally too. But to help people realize that it's really okay and actually healthy to do that is.
And if somebody's really motivated by what they're going to produce, say like, look, okay, 2 years from now, if you stop and do the hard work now of being uncomfortable and really pressing into that, you will be more effective then too. And so kind of putting it in some of that investment language or whatever.
Right. So there is a cost to rushing through that phase.
Yeah, absolutely.
And often language learning is a part of that phase, which is really hard sometimes to measure, or you feel like you've hit a plateau, or you're like, how am I still B1? I really need to get to C or whatever it is. I'm about to take us in a different direction because I had somebody recently ask me questions about capacity. She's leading a team, and a lot of the leaders are struggling with understanding how to have good expectations for their staff and help staff be able to be in a healthy place, because it seems like there's a pretty wide range of capacities. Everyone's living cross-culturally in cultures significantly different than theirs of origin. So I've been trying to help put together a questionnaire, which I'd love to share with you and get some feedback on kind of being able to actually know internally what is somebody's energy or capacity. Like, what are the things that are really just draining about living cross-culturally? What are the things that are really life-giving, and how to balance that and help set expectations? Do you have any thoughts on that, and how to even have those kind of conversations about energy and capacity and room for you said 75 or 80%. That's my experience too. But I think even within that, some people, especially in that neutral stage, or maybe 50%, and they're trying to slowly get up. How do you even have those kinds of conversations with people?
Yeah, it's really, really tough, in part because I think often the expectations that we have of ourselves, as well as the expectations of our colleagues, and certainly people who are sending you to wherever you are. There's kind of this feeling of like, okay, you've been there 3 or 6 months, like you should kind of be doing something measurable by now, which often that expectation is hitting at about the same time that people are getting to the worst parts of the transition experience. And so it's like, your own expectation is so mismatched with your own reality. And then when that's amplified from the outside, I think that can be really just so challenging and demoralizing.
Also done overtly and not overtly. So sometimes the organization or the managers are saying, okay, it's time to be productive. And then sometimes it's just kind of comparing to where other people are, or being asked a question like, how has work been? And interpreting that as like, oh, they think I'm not doing enough.
Yeah.
Well, you touch on this in your book that, especially from an American culture, we have such a high value on productivity and efficiency. And then a lot of these cultures that we're interacting with put a high value on relationship and time together. And sometimes that's very productive relation, but it doesn't look productive.
Yeah, it's a totally different productive focus, right? Yeah.
And I remember, because we were in Central Asia last week, and I remember, oh, right, sitting and talking for hours is very important to them. And that's going to help so much toward building toward the work, but it doesn't really, you don't come home at the end of the day saying, look what we produced here.
Right, like what goes on your spreadsheet at the end of the day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't keep spreadsheets. But
Getting stuff done matters, right? I hope, like, because it's something that I try to do is get stuff done. But like, it's tricky.
Yeah.
Is there any way to have those kinds of conversations and it not be comparative to other people?
I almost think you have to let it be comparative to other people and then remove the value judgments with it. I think because the comparison is so automatic. And so to say, yeah, here's how this person's doing it, here's how this person's doing it. But I don't know, it often doesn't feel safe. And so I think that depends a lot on team structure and the kinds of trust that's being both modeled and developed. I think certainly when people who are leading other people are able to lead in their weakness as well as their strength, then that makes it much safer to have some of that conversation. But I don't know, that's just kind of my gut reaction. I don't know that I've thought about it enough to have an informed opinion.
What do you think, James?
Yeah, I think that safety is a big part of it. I mean, I work with people. We just met with somebody talking about women in ministry and work and balancing parenting and motherhood with work. And I know that that's something that comes up a lot, because you'll have this person who can manage 4 kids and work part-time and run like some sort of home business selling jams in the market and, kind of all of this stuff. And then there's another mom that's just like, I don't know how I'm going to make it till 7 p.m. tonight and everybody be alive. So there's sometimes where I think that comparison is not helpful just because people are kind of wired differently. But I totally see where you're at. Like there is an element of like, I'm trying so hard to gain my bearings and understanding from my own experience. It's kind of hard to do in a vacuum. So, and we just don't. We just can't not be aware of others' experiences and what they're doing, and might be better to lean into it a little bit.
I wonder, we talked about this value like our American culture has about efficiency and productivity. Do you see other aspects, particularly of American culture, that we tend to bring with us that can be like a hang up for people?
I think that one of the things that can be challenging when individualism, so this identification primarily as the self rather than as the group, when individualism plays out in a way that detaches somebody from their own group, or that makes it so that when they're looking at the question of am I okay, it's dependent solely on the individual and not on how is my group doing, or how, whether that's my family or larger group. I think sometimes that can lead to some unique challenges. There are different challenges that people from a collectivist background would face. So it's just how is it playing out? The near future orientation that we tend to have as Americans can also be challenging from a couple different perspectives. One is some of the longer term identity pieces, where are your people from, that kind of thing, can get pushed on in ways that sometimes we're not well equipped to deal with, because we tend to be focused in that kind of near future. And at the same time, because we're not looking long term future, if we're in that kind of 5-year in front of us window, it can make it really hard to think through, okay, what are going to be sustainable, healthy patterns for me, for my family in the next, generation, and so there are things, I think things that I wouldn't say that it's uniquely difficult for Americans. I would just say that the difficulties are expressed in unique ways.
Mm.
One of the questions that came up, I think, on Brandy's email that is just interesting is thinking about the places of struggle. And I'm wondering what could be done better on the front end to help prepare people well for that neutral zone.
Yeah, it's something I've really wrestled with as somebody who was involved with preparing people before they went, working with them while they were gone, and then interacting with them when they come back. And then also I've done some work with people who are first term returners, like, so they've been gone for 4 or 5 years and then are coming back and doing some processing with that. And then also people who are longer term. So I've seen people in different stages, and then having recently walked through leaving home and coming somewhere else myself. I think that one of the things that I wish there was more attention to is helping people to identify what is ending before it ends. Because I think that once something has ended, if it surprises you, and this is kind of back to the expectations piece, then I think that can be really hard. So like before we left, we started to identify and mourn certain losses, down to things like there was a coffee shop that we would go to. So we lived in a town that had a little river, and there was a pedestrian bridge, and we walk across the pedestrian bridge over to this coffee shop on Thursday mornings. And the barista Connor was always there, and he would always tell me what I wanted to drink that day, you know. and we realized as we were getting ready to leave that was going to be something that we were going to be really sad not to have. And so we stopped and we let ourselves feel that even while we were still experiencing the goodness of being in it. And I think little things like that were really helpful in our particular journey. But I think as I see other people who kind of sometimes don't realize until they've been gone for 2 or 3 years, some of the things that had ended for them. Some of the endings are super obvious, right? We sold our house. That was obvious. But there were so many non-obvious endings that were wrapped up in that. I think those are the kinds of things that paying more attention to them before they happen, as they happen, giving people space for that can be really helpful. I think a lot of times so much energy is on the logistics of how do we get where we're going, that how do we mourn where we're leaving is kind of left off.
I think that a lot of times we do that well for people leaving the foreign experience back to their home country. But even as you're talking, I'm like, wow, I bet that does not happen normally as you're coaching, as organizations are coaching their staff on leaving the home country. And that's just, it would make so much sense, because I think a lot of the material that's out there, particularly on exit and reentry, like, are you familiar with RAFT, the acronym for transitions? And I know stuff for families is geared towards that, saying goodbye to your favorite restaurant and your park that you went to. But I've only ever heard of that about leaving the place that you have been living that's cross-cultural and going back to home. How helpful that would be, I think, for people on the front end.
But it's also beneficial to give yourself that space to really look at what you're saying goodbye to, and not, like you said, just the house or the car, things like that. Your sense of competency,
right?
Language.
So I think though are really difficult for people to imagine that, like, and so I mean there was a sense of like, because I had seen other people going through it, we were kind of going to the grocery store, and I feel like the grocery store is such a banal example of this, but it's so everyday that it really matters. And yeah, going to the grocery store before we left, like, I know where things are.
Right.
Right. My next door neighbor was listening to our podcast, and he was like, wow, are you guys talking really fast, or is that normal English speed? I was like, I think it's normal. And I was telling him, in my language, I'm actually intelligent, because all of my Spanish conversations have been so incredibly rough.
I felt that way in Central Asia too. Like, language was like at this 3 or 4-year-old level.
Well, and I'm at this stage where I'm losing my own language, in the midst of it. And oh my goodness, the typos that are coming out of me right now. It's like, what? I think the hardest, the people who I've seen struggle the most are the people who have an identity built around being good at doing it, who then struggle. Yeah. When there's a sense that somebody says, I can do this well, and then and then the realities of a new cultural space and a new transition, blah, blah, blah. So especially people who moved a lot before or grew up moving or had to have this sense of, because of my education or whatever, feel like they should be really good at it, at the cross-cultural transition, and then are faced with the difficulties of it, often are the people who I've seen have the most difficult things, the most difficult experiences of culture shock and transition. And that has to do, I think, with the extra challenge to their identity. And that's really rough. And one of the things that I think is especially rough is when people then, because they have this belief that they're really good at it, refuse to press in and work through the hardness. I think they really risk, I don't know, you guys would have better words for this, but I think they really risk injuring themselves long term.
Mm-hmm.
You probably could sum up that kind of what you're saying is people who may struggle more are those who are less likely to go to some of the deeper core places that are being triggered by their cross-cultural experience.
Yeah. And I think then looking at what would keep somebody from going to those places. Yeah. And if part of the cost is saying, well, I'm not good at something I thought I was good at, that cost often is difficult for people to pay.
Right.
I've actually seen a lot of third culture kids, so kids that have grown up in a multicultural situation, sometimes struggle in their adulthood because they kind of have this deep underlying, I'm really good at this. I've lived, I've traveled, I've been more places than the people I went to university with. And their expectation and their identity is so much in their ability to do this kind of thing that when they do go, and what's really happening is they're finding out their parents were navigating a whole lot more than they realized that was happening. And then they're kind of struggling. And I think it is that deeper core issue. Now, many TCKs just fly through it because they really are well equipped for navigating life cross-culturally. But there are some that I think have so much of their identity based on it. And when they get there and it's not quite how they remembered it or like they thought they were, it's just really, really hard.
It could be so, I mean, it blows up, it risks blowing up their world, right?
Yeah.
Did you wrote this before you guys moved overseas?
Yeah. So I had lived in Japan for a couple of years as a kid.
Okay.
And then in college studied in Mexico for a bit. And then I wrote it after having worked with students, for several years who were doing these 6-month overseas experiences.
Okay. So after you guys moved here, did you look at this and have any aha moments like, I get this even on a deeper level now that we've lived through this?
I don't think that at this point anyway, I don't think I've been surprised by anything that we've experienced, because it's, I mean, that's the great thing, because these weren't my theories. Like, somebody else had done the hard work of figuring it out, and I was just trying to express it. And so I think I was like, okay, yeah, this is that, and this is familiar. But it is really interesting to kind of get this new layer of depth to it.
Yeah, I wonder if knowing this in advance helped you. I think it would help you.
I think what helped probably the most, so knowing it in advance, and this is one of those questions of like, what kind of preparation is helpful? I mean, I don't know. I've worked with, I don't know, either dozens or scores of people before they went somewhere and taught some of these ideas. Sometimes I fear that introducing people to something like culture shock inoculates them against the goodness of knowing about it. Like they're like, oh well, I already know about that, so I've done the hard work. And it's like, no, you haven't. Like, you just know it exists. And so I'm not always sure that pre-training is even all that useful. But I think that what was the most helpful was, because I was already bought in on the ideas of it, having somebody walk through it with my wife and I on an ongoing basis was really, really healthy for us. Yeah. I mean, having space where my colleague was saying, and I think this was also part of it, right? This was with my colleague who was onboarding us, who, months in was saying, okay, so like, what is culture shock for you like today? And working through, like, there's the list from L. Robert Cole's, the list of the symptoms of culture shock. And, so it's stuff that's not great. It doesn't feel good to admit about yourself, but to have somebody who's close to you, who's saying, hey, are you experiencing, random fits of laughter or weeping? Like, yeah,
same day.
Right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a lot of field coordinators and administrators who are asking me as the counselor to help them better evaluate people, because they're like, wow, we're just having people who are really struggling and not functioning well. And how do we better, recruit, analyze, get all the good details. And I think you just said it. There's limits to how well somebody can be prepared because we just really don't know how somebody's going to react to that cross-cultural stress until they've lived it. Mm-hmm. There's just not good normal life, home culture situations that really represent well all of the parts that are a part of that transition, and especially cross-culturally.
What would you like for sending organizations or sending churches to know?
Yeah, this was one of the other things that motivated the book and motivates me to keep working with the material. Did a revision a few years ago. I want them to know how hard it is for the people they're sending, and that the people that they're sending often won't be able to express even themselves how hard it is. And I think that part of where that's so potentially helpful is the level of support that people can give those who are going across cultures. I don't know. It can be maybe level's not the right word, but there are ways that you can really strategically help people who are walking through stuff, but understanding that they're really having a hard time and that they're probably editing what they're sharing with you, because they don't want to overwhelm you and, just all this stuff. Yeah. As far as organizations go, I do get very frustrated with organizations that don't provide enough space for people or enough support for people who are going through things, who just are like, well, just do it. You're fine. Just go do it. And who point the blame at individuals. That I get very impatient with, because what we're asking of people is so difficult. Yeah.
Sometimes it's self-imposed value of productivity. And then sometimes it's specifically communicated where, are you meeting these specific numbers? Like there's one organization that has so many people, you have to meet so many new people every single week. And I was working with a family living, remote, difficult, no running water, no electricity, just cooking, homeschooling their 4 kids. And like, they had the same expectations as people living in a modern city of you have to be meeting these specific requirements the whole time. And for that organization, it's just massively unhelpful and unrealistic. And there was just no sense for the cost of that transition on the family and doing normal life. So I think both for people to work on themselves and not project, and also for organizations and families to have an idea of what the actual cost is. That's why it's so helpful, I think, when families can visit, or friends even can visit, the people that are living cross-culturally and get a sense of what it's like.
Especially if it's not too soon.
Yeah, that's right.
Sometimes people visiting too soon can kind of disrupt the transition process.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to definitely put your book as a resource on our podcast, on our links, whatever. What am I saying?
Show notes. Show
notes. Thank you. Could not think of that. Would you have any other resources that you'd recommend?
My book. So start there. Is it on Kindle? Is your book available virtually?
Yeah, so the book is available both in print and as an ebook, and then there are some videos that explain some of the topics a little bit more thoroughly. And then there are a bunch of other resources. I mentioned William Bridges' Transitions book, L. Robert Cole's Survival Kit for Overseas Living. There's some more that have come out more recently dealing with the culture shock and reentry. Yeah, I've got a link that has other links, and so I'll send that to you as well.
Yeah, we love that.
If I can add a shameless plug, my wife helped put together a bunch of exercises for families in the midst of transition. So things that they can do together, and it's available on the sentwell.org website.
Awesome.
Thanks, Stephen. It's really been nice talking to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
Yeah, great to have you. And thanks for stepping out of your own transition in the middle of it to tell us about your book and your experience.
Yeah.
Oh, tell us about your podcast too.
Yeah.
So there's, so I've been mentioning this podcast where we processed our own transition, and that one, the name is changing but it'll be called the Tracks Cultures Podcast, which connects to the resources from the book. And then I also have a podcast, Professors in Rooms Getting Coffee, which I do with a buddy that I used to teach with in Minnesota. And yeah, so we talk about the intersection of faith and scholarship. Have a lot of fun with that.
It's really good.
Thanks.
Nice.